Before I tell you what happened, I want to ask you this. If someone quietly took everything you cherished and still smiled at you like nothing ever happened, what would you do?
I never imagined that the first person to betray me would be someone I once loved, like my own grandchild. This happened not too long ago, but even now, there are nights when I sit still, a cup of cold tea in my hands, staring out the window, unable to find the calm I used to know. It's not anger that keeps me up. It's the unanswered question: how can someone take so much from another without feeling a trace of guilt? My name is Elaine Whitaker. I'm 74 years old, and I live alone in Sarasota, a quiet coastal city in Southwest Florida. I used to be a human resources manager in the hospitality industry, and I retired early after my husband passed. I'm not wealthy, but I've never gone without. I have a small cream-colored house, a wooden porch with an old rocking chair, a cat named Murphy, and a few elderly neighbors I can call friends. I still go to the farmer's market every Saturday morning, drop by the corner bakery, where they remember how I like my coffee. I lived a simple, steady life, peaceful enough until that one morning. I slipped in the bathroom. Just a small accident, but for someone my age, one fall can change everything. I lay there for almost an hour, unable to lift myself, calling out weakly until my neighbor across the street, Donna, a retired nurse, heard something and rushed over. Thanks to her, I was taken to the hospital in time. At the hospital, the doctor said I had a broken hip. I would need surgery, and then at least a week of recovery. In that moment of helplessness, I did what anyone would do. I called family. I only have one grandnephew, Ben, my younger sister's son, the baby I once held in my arms, the child I fed with a spoon. But since marrying Angela, his wife, he rarely visited. Still, I held on to the kind of faith only older people seem to have, that blood ties eventually find their way back when needed. I called Ben. No one answered. Later that evening, Angela called me back, her tone distant and flat. She said, "We heard. Don't worry. We'll stop by the house to check on things." I was relieved. At least they remembered. I reminded her the key was still under the stone pot by the front door, like always. I also added, "Angela, there's a tin box in the bedroom dresser with some aspirin. Doctor says I'll need it." She simply replied, "Okay." I closed my eyes, trying to believe that I still had someone to count on, that the home I left behind in pain would be kept safe, its belongings, its memories. But I had no idea that while I lay quietly in that hospital bed, someone I trusted most was slowly taking away everything I had carefully kept for a lifetime. I returned home on a Wednesday afternoon under one of those rare, overcast Sarasota skies. The medical van pulled up quietly by the curb. A young nurse gently helped me down, guiding my slow steps up the front porch. Before she left, she bowed her head slightly and wished me a speedy recovery. Then she drove away, leaving me standing alone in a space that was once familiar, but now somehow distant. The house looked the same: red-tiled roof, cream-colored walls, geraniums still blooming along the porch rail. But as I stepped inside, I felt something subtle, small, elusive that didn't feel right. I couldn't name it at first. Maybe it was the doormat slightly askew. Maybe the photo frame on the shelf had shifted just enough to be noticed. Or maybe it was the scent in the air, a faint foreign smell, like someone who didn't belong had stayed here too long. I made my way into the bedroom. Every step was slow, every movement aching from the surgery. But the ache in my chest was different. I opened the old wooden dresser on the right side of the bed. the one where I kept the most precious things I owned, not just in value, but in memory. The silver tin box was still there, but when I opened it, it was empty. Gone was the white pearl necklace my mother wore in her wedding portrait. Gone was the sapphire hairpin Mr. Whitaker gave me on our 30th anniversary. Gone was the old wedding ring I used to hold in my hand whenever the nights felt too heavy. All of it gone. I sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding the now empty velvet-lined box, my heart just as hollow. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, like someone who had opened a treasure chest, only to find it had been emptied long ago. That evening, I messaged Angela. I didn't accuse her. I didn't threaten. I simply wrote one line, "I can't find the aspirin in the silver box." "Did you happen to take it last time?" She replied, almost immediately. Said she hadn't touched anything. Suggested maybe I had put it somewhere else by mistake. Misplaced it. I've lived in this house for over 30 years. I know every pill, every drawer, every scratch on the wood. I didn't misplace anything, and I didn't need proof to know that I had lost more than just a few pieces of jewelry. I had lost the last bit of trust I held for someone I once thought of as family. Still, I said nothing more. People my age don't react in haste. We've seen enough loss to know that some things can't be fixed with words, only with silence long enough and memory clear enough to carry us through. And from that moment on, I knew I was no longer someone who could sit quietly and do nothing. Angela thought I was just a forgetful old woman. She assumed I would eventually forget, that she could throw out a few vague words, and everything would quietly fade away. She didn't know a thing about me, and that was her first mistake. I wasn't the kind of woman who just brewed tea and knitted scarves. Before I retired, I had worked in the hotel industry for 40 years. I started as a front desk clerk at a tiny Holiday Inn near the Clearwater coast, and over time, I became a regional human resources director for an entire chain of hotels across Florida. I had interviewed, hired, fired, and trained more than 1,000 people in my career. I could look someone in the eye and tell if they were lying. I was never one for drama, but I remembered everything. I remembered how people behaved. I remembered their tone, their glances, and even their silences. Angela forgot that someone who had once held together entire personnel systems didn't need to raise her voice to prove anything. After a simple dinner of cauliflower and toast, I made myself a cup of black tea, pulled out an old notebook, and sat down at the kitchen table. I started writing out everything in order. The day I texted Angela about the aspirin, the day I went into the hospital, the day I returned the timestamps of her replies. I recorded every detail, a professional habit that never left me. Then I opened my laptop. Angela used eBay. I knew that from a few past conversations. She used to brag about flipping secondhand finds from flea markets. I searched using a few simple keywords: antique pearl necklace, vintage sapphire hairpin gold, wedding band from the 1960s. It didn't take long before I came across several listings marked "Sold All" under a familiar seller name, Angela Designs. Each item was described as inherited from a family estate. I let out a small, bitter laugh. She had written that herself. She had no idea that when you've lived long enough, you start recognizing the signs. You can tell exactly who's digging their own grave. I didn't call. I didn't text. I simply closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to the bookshelf in my bedroom. In the bottom corner was a small wooden box, the one where I kept things for someday. I never thought I'd need to open it again. The old business cards, the handwritten thank you notes, the little notebook listing every meaningful connection I had made during my career. But now, I knew someday had finally arrived. I spent that entire evening sitting at the dining table, sorting through old business cards one by one. Names, job titles, handwriting, even coffee stains on the paper. Each card was a trace of the years I had once spent navigating the working world, a place where no one gave you anything for free, and where kindness was rare but precious. I paused when I reached a name I'd never forgotten, Mary Ellen Rosario. Back when I was a regional HR director for a hotel chain in Tampa, she had been a young receptionist, eager, quiet, and observant. But I had seen something in her eyes, a work ethic that didn't need to be broadcast, a hunger to learn that didn't ask for applause. I remember once telling her, when she asked to stay late and study the management protocols, "Someday, you won't need permission to enter the manager's office. You'll be the one holding the keys." I flipped over her card. The phone number was still the same. I called. The phone rang a few times before someone picked up. A surprised and warm voice came through the line. "Elaine, is that really you?" We talked for a long while. I didn't rush. I told her about the fall, the surgery, and how grateful I was to still have a few things left, like memories, and a handful of people who had weathered life's storms alongside me. I didn't mention Angela right away, but Mary Ellen was sharp. She asked gently if something more was going on, and that's when I slowly began to piece the story together. Not out of anger, not as a plea for help, but simply laying out the facts, the missing items, the eBay account, the heirlooms, gone, and how I had found it all. The next day, I visited Mary Ellen at her office, inside a high-end event center in downtown Sarasota. The office was bright, neat, with a small cluster of purple orchids in the corner. She still carried the same calm presence I remembered from years ago. I handed her a thin folder, screenshots of online listings, item descriptions tied to Angela's account, and a few of my handwritten notes, dates, timestamps, evidence. I didn't ask her to do anything in particular. I simply said that I couldn't stand by while people continued trusting in an image built on deceit, especially when that person represented a place I once believed in. Mary Ellen didn't say much, but the look in her eyes told me everything. She would act, not because I was once her mentor, but because truth, once revealed, refuses to stay buried. I stepped out of that building into Sarasota's soft, golden light. In my hand was a to-go cup of coffee. In my heart was the quiet satisfaction of placing a single stone back where it belonged, in a house of justice most people had forgotten was still standing. This wasn't revenge. I had simply nudged the truth downhill and let it gather momentum on its own. The news didn't hit me like thunder. It didn't come crashing in. Instead, it arrived like a cold draft through the window, unclear, quiet, but just enough to tell me the season had changed. 3 days after my meeting with Mary Ellen, I received a short message from an old friend. She now works as an internal accountant for an events company in the city. The message was brief. "Angela's been suspended. Management is aware." I set my phone down without reacting. I walked out to the porch and sat in my usual rocking chair. Murphy the cat jumped onto my lap and curled up. I gently stroked his back, my hands trembling slightly from the freshly steeped tea. But inside, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt hollow. A long silence stretched inside me, like the moment after finishing a book and not knowing whether to reopen the first page or close it for good. I didn't call Ben. I didn't message Angela. I didn't speak a word of it to the neighbors. I understood something very clearly, and maybe Angela was beginning to understand it too. Some punishments don't come from outrage. They come from the silence of a community that's done believing in you. Angela used to stand out in every crowd, from luxury weddings to Sunday morning yoga classes. She always knew what to wear, what to say, where to sit to be noticed. But after everything, people began falling silent when she entered the room. One friend from the book club mentioned that Angela hadn't shown up for the weekly gatherings. Another said they hadn't seen her drop off her daughter at school in weeks. Someone else whispered that she'd been quietly removed from the VIP client list at the event center. Everything was happening slowly, softly, but anyone paying attention could see this was how Sarasota speaks when it no longer wants to keep someone in its circle. No one mentioned my name. I didn't need them to. I didn't need credit. What I wanted wasn't payback. It was for her to feel the loss, not of objects, but of trust. One afternoon, I stopped by a little bookstore on Main Street to look for a few classic novels. As I was browsing the shelves, I noticed a familiar figure standing still among the aisles. It was Angela. She was wearing a worn denim jacket, her hair pulled into a rushed bun, dark circles under her eyes. In her hands was an open book, unread. Her eyes weren't on the page. They were distant, unfocused. Our eyes met. I didn't flinch. I didn't move toward her. I simply gave her a quiet nod, a greeting, without words. She stood frozen for a few seconds, then lowered her gaze and walked away. No words, none were needed. I picked up the book I had been holding and took it to the counter. As I stepped outside, the Florida sun was still blazing as always, but something inside me had settled. Not because Angela was finally paying a price, but because I no longer felt like something had been taken from me. Sarasota was never a particularly bustling place, but it also wasn't quiet enough for secrets to stay hidden for long. Here, gossip doesn't spread through headlines. It travels through glances in the grocery store, through whispers, over coffee, through names, quietly left off invitation lists. Angela probably thought this would blow over, like many other things had. But what she didn't understand was that in towns like Sarasota, losing trust isn't like being disliked. It's like being erased from the community's map. She began disappearing from familiar spaces. Her weekly fundraiser photos stopped showing up on social media. The Saturday morning yoga class was missing its usual presence in the back corner, where she used to stand with that confident smile and well-rehearsed greetings for everyone. I didn't seek these stories out. They found their way to me through casual conversations, scattered messages from former mutual friends, even from the florist who sold me the same bouquet every Friday. Someone mentioned that Angela no longer took her daughter to the downtown art class. Another said they saw her crying alone in the parking lot after work, holding what looked like a resignation letter. No one asked directly. No one wanted to make it obvious. But everyone could see she was slowly drifting away from the position she once thought was unshakable. I recognized the feeling. I'd seen that same look before in employees who had been suspended in those unraveling after being quietly let go. It wasn't the look of someone searching for someone to blame. It was the look of someone who no longer knew where they belonged. Another time, while I was pushing my cart through the grocery store, I saw her. Angela was coming from the opposite direction, holding a paper bag, her eyes lowered. As we passed, she glanced up briefly, just long enough to meet my eyes, then quickly looked away. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to, because I saw it clearly. She had seen herself reflected in me, not as an old woman, but as a mirror. That evening, I stood for a long while, out on the porch, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, before I even realized. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I only felt quiet, as if everything that needed to fall had finally done so, and now the ground beneath me had stopped trembling. I had no more words to say, because everything I needed her to know. She was already beginning to feel day by day. I was making tea when I heard a knock at the door. 3 taps light and hesitant. Not the firm knock of the mailman, nor the casual one of a neighbor. I knew the moment I stepped onto the porch and saw her Angela standing there that this wasn't a routine visit. She wore an old hoodie, no makeup, and held something wrapped in a scarf. Her eyes were red, her expression unsure, like someone who wasn't certain they were welcome. I didn't say anything. I just opened the door and stepped aside. She understood she could come in. The way Angela crossed my threshold that day was nothing like the woman who used to glide through elegant cocktail parties. She looked more like a child, coming home after running away and forgetting how to find the front steps. We sat in the living room. I made tea, as always, poured 2 cups, one for her, one for me. The room was filled with the sound of a spoon clinking softly against porcelain. She sat in silence for a long time, unsure how to begin. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Angela said she didn't know where to start. Her voice was shaky and hoarse, like someone who hadn't had a full night's sleep in weeks. From the scarf, she unwrapped something and gently placed it on the table, a small wooden box. I recognized it instantly. It was my mother's diary, the one I had thought had vanished, along with the stolen jewelry. Angela said she had found it while going through some old things, maybe after her last visit to my house. She suggested she must have taken it by accident, but I knew nothing about what had happened had been accidental. I wasn't angry. I didn't act forgiving either. I simply looked at the box, then at Angela, and I told her not harshly, not softly, that she hadn't forgotten it. She had chosen to forget until she realized there are things that once lost can never be bought back. Angela said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly. Her eyes were wet. She admitted she didn't know who she was anymore, that everything around her seemed to be collapsing at once, and she didn't know where to begin fixing it. I replied quietly, but clearly, that nothing falls apart in a single night. It's the result of countless small choices every time we look the other way, every time we nod when we know we shouldn't. She didn't argue. She just sat there, silent tears slipping down onto her hands. No dramatic sobbing, no apologies. Just a woman who had realized she'd stood on the wrong side of the line for too long and forgotten how to find her way back. When she stood up to leave, Angela didn't say another word. I didn't walk her to the door, but as it clicked shut behind her, I knew the space between us wasn't as frozen as it once was. It wasn't warm yet, but the ice had started to melt. Angela didn't return right away. She didn't send any messages after that day either. The door had closed behind her, like a quiet punctuation mark. Not a confirmation, not a denial, but to me, that silence said the most. The days that followed were filled with rain. In Sarasota, I still woke up early. As always, made tea, fed. Murphy sat reading the morning paper in my old wool sweater. Life outside went on as usual. Leaves fell. Cars passed. The smell of toasted bread drifted over from the neighbor's house. But inside me, something began to shift. Not my feelings about Angela, but my feelings about myself. One afternoon, I sat for a long time by the window, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, and I asked myself, what is it I really want? An apology, the return of what was taken, a confession, or simply the feeling that I wasn't invisible to my own family. I thought about it for a long time, and then I realized perhaps what had unsettled me the most wasn't the loss itself, but the feeling that I had let someone take my worth without standing up for it. I had lived my whole life with principles, worked hard, loved quietly, gave without expecting anything in return. But when something was taken from me, when I was treated as disposable, no one stood up for me, except me. And I did. Not by shouting, not through revenge. I simply stood up, not to teach Angela a lesson, but to remind myself that I still had a choice to keep carrying the weight of anger, or to set it down, like letting go of a stone pressed against my chest. That evening, I walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out the wooden box my mother had left me, her old journal. I opened it for the first time in years and began to read. Her handwriting was still steady, neat, deliberate, so much so I could almost hear her voice as I read. She once wrote, "If someone hurts you, remember forgiveness isn't because they deserve it. It's because you deserve to live lighter." I closed the book, placed it in my lap, and sat still for a long time. No tears, no deep sighs, just stillness. But inside me, the weight was finally beginning to lift. Angela came back on a late afternoon, with light rain, a soft breeze, and a gray Sarasota sky, as if the whole world wanted to fall quiet for a moment. I heard a knock at the door this time, not hesitant like before, nor urgent, just enough to let the person inside know that someone was standing out there, hoping to be let in. When I opened the door, she stood there, her raincoat still on hair-damp arms, wrapped around a small paper bag, as if she were carrying everything that remained after a life had been turned upside down. I didn't say a word. I simply stepped aside to let her in. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't demand anything. She just walked in like someone who once belonged to a place they lost and no longer knew if they were welcome. I poured tea, chamomile, the same kind as always. 2 cups, one for me, one for her. She sat on the edge of the sofa, not leaning back, hands gripping the cup like it held the last fragile thing she had left. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice so soft it seemed she was afraid to hear it herself. She said she no longer knew who she had become, that each passing day made her feel more like a stranger to herself, that she kept wondering, how does someone slowly lose their kindness, and not even notice I didn't answer right away. I just looked out the window where a single raindrop was sliding down the glass like a tear. Then I spoke not to her, but almost as if I were talking to myself. No one becomes someone else overnight. It happens little by little. Every time we stay silent when we should speak, every time we choose convenience over decency, and one day we wake up and can't recognize the person in the mirror. She said nothing in return, just sat still. When she finally stood to leave, she bowed her head, not in apology, but like someone who knew they had to relearn how to walk with dignity. I didn't say I forgive you. I didn't walk her to the door, but I knew that day I had laid something down, light as breath. That night, with only me in the quiet house, I stood by the fireplace, watching the flames dance, holding a warm cup of tea. I wasn't thinking about the missing jewelry anymore, or the betrayal. I was thinking one thing only: I had survived my own heartbreak. And inside me, a quiet voice whispered, not for Angela, but for myself, I forgive. Not because she deserved it, but because I deserved to sleep one night without carrying the weight of bitterness.